So picture this. You're sitting in a heavy, shadow-filled Victorian parlor. It looks wealthy, right? Comfortably furnished with those thick velvet curtains and a warm hearth. But for the woman sitting in that room, it's actually a legally constructed cage. Listen to this stark quote from the highly influential English jurist William Blackstone. The legal reality of the era was just absolute. The very second a woman said "I do," her entire legal existence, her literal being in the eyes of the law, was completely suspended. She was effectively erased. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely stunning reality from Victorian England. When we think of 19th century convents, popular culture often paints them as these oppressive, shadowy dungeons or places of forced seclusion, right? But our sources reveal a fascinatingly different story. We're going to look at these quiet cloisters not as prisons, but as radical escapes. Escapes for women who were desperately seeking autonomy and a life outside that suffocating domestic sphere. To really understand why they needed to escape, we have to look at the sheer totality of this legal trap known as coverture. Under this common law doctrine, which, by the way, was deeply rooted in England and fully inherited by the United States, a married woman became a theme covered, basically a covered woman. And what did that actually mean? Well, it meant she couldn't own property in her own name. She couldn't keep her own wages. She couldn't sign a legally binding contract. And she literally couldn't even get an education if her husband said no. Everything she brought into the marriage, and legally everything she was entirely swallowed up by her husband. So women of this era faced a stark, uncompromising choice. You had the femme sole, an adult, unmarried woman who, which might be surprising to hear today, actually kept her right to own property and make contracts in her own name. But then you had the femme covert, the married woman facing complete legal erasure. Entering into the highly romanticized Victorian marriage literally meant surrendering your independent identity. For a fiercely independent or ambitious woman, the marriage altar wasn't some grand triumph, it was a total surrender of self. Now imagine stepping out of that stuffy, shadowy domestic parlor and into the sweeping, magnificent stained glass architecture of a newly built convent. The air smells faintly of beeswax candles and cold stone. It's a completely different world. In 1829, Catholic emancipation allowed convents to quietly exist again in England, and the response from women, it was explosive. By 1851, there were 53 convents established across England and Wales. Women were quite literally voting with their feet, seeking out these beautiful, imposing structures as an alternative to the marriage plot. And the acceleration was undeniable. Just 2 years later, in 1853, that number surged to 75. A member of Parliament actually stood up and read these exact numbers out loud in the House of Commons, and he read them like a man watching a wildfire spread out of control. Because to the men holding political power, this wasn't just a slow religious revival. This sudden, heavily funded building boom of Gothic architecture and female-led spaces looked like an invasion. By the end of the century, a staggering 10,000 British women had sought a new life in Anglican sisterhoods alone. And honestly, that's not even counting the thousands more moving into growing Catholic congregations. This was no fringe movement. We're talking about an entire alternative career path opening up, decade by decade, running in parallel right underneath a patriarchal society that assumed marriage was the only possible destination for a respectable woman. These women were deliberately trading silk gowns for modest habits, choosing the bustling wards of charity hospitals and quiet libraries over polite tea parties. So why were so many thousands drawn to the veil? Well, the contrast is pretty eye-opening. Victorian marriage usually meant giving up your wealth and facing lifelong domestic confinement. But convent life? It offered shared property, continuous education, a profound, very real sense of sisterhood, and meaningful public work. These women weren't just sitting quietly in contemplative rooms all day. They were managing massive financial accounts, running school curriculums, staffing sprawling hospitals, and navigating real, substantial administrative authority. It was kind of a game changer. It was one of the only jobs on the market that actually let a woman manage an institution. What's incredibly fascinating is how some leaders pushed this autonomy even further. Enter Elizabeth Prout. Historically, joining a convent required a massive dowry, a big chunk of money paid to the community, much like a marriage dowry, which meant only wealthy women could actually afford this escape. But Prout came in and instituted a radically different rule: absolutely no dowry required. She opened the doors to destitute factory girls, and she based roles strictly on individual aptitude. For the very first time, an impoverished mill girl working in the slums of Manchester could make the exact same choice to escape the marriage market as a wealthy heiress. The patriarchal panic, the Victorian backlash to female autonomy. As you might expect, as thousands of women found this unparalleled freedom, the predominantly Protestant patriarchal society of Victorian England flew into an absolute panic. This authentic period propaganda, a broadside titled "The Flare-Up in the Confessional," really captures the mood. The sources show how an entire commercial industry sprang up practically overnight, weaponizing anti-Catholic sentiment to spread sensationalized, highly eroticized lies. A lot of men in Victorian society simply couldn't comprehend. They literally couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that women would voluntarily choose celibacy, strict rules, and hard work over marriage to them. So they just fabricated stories of lewd, deceptive priests capturing naive maidens to explain away women's desire for independence. Perhaps the most famous or infamous example of this hysteria was the awful disclosures of Maria Monk. This was a completely fabricated, best-selling memoir that alleged underground dungeons, horrifying abuses, and captive wealthy heiresses trapped within convent walls. It was entirely a work of fiction, yet it was greedily consumed by a society that was absolutely terrified of what unsupervised women were actually doing behind those heavy oak doors. They massively preferred to view these women as helpless victims rather than autonomous agents defining their own futures. But why exactly was the patriarchy so terrified? It centers heavily on the Catholic practice of confession. To Victorian men, the idea of their wives or daughters privately whispering their intimate thoughts and sins to an unmarried male priest completely bypassed their absolute patriarchal authority. It ripped the sacred shroud of secrecy right off the Victorian domestic household. The convent system didn't just separate women from men, it entirely removed the need for a husband's rule and oversight. The legacy of autonomy, from the cloister to the vote. The quiet, disciplined rebellion of these modest dormitories didn't just stay contained behind high stone walls. Tracing the long, arduous fall of coverture reveals a really fascinating timeline. In the 1840s, right as the convent boom was accelerating, early feminist protests began directly targeting these property restrictions. By 1870, the first Married Women's Property Act was passed in the UK, slowly beginning to return property rights and legal identity to wives. But incredibly, get this, it wasn't until 1966 that the US Supreme Court finally declared the institution of coverture entirely obsolete. 1966. The legal victories over these decades mirrored the exact autonomy and property rights those early Victorian sisters first sought in the sanctuary of the convent. This history profoundly matters today, because the rights we often take for granted now, the simple ability to own a bank account, sign a lease, or just exist as a separate legal entity from a spouse, were hard-won battles rooted in these very acts of historical defiance. As we fade from the quiet, candlelit chapel to the golden hour sunlight of modern freedom, I want to leave you with a lingering question to chew on. What did true freedom and true sacrifice actually look like for the women of our past? It took immense, unimaginable courage to choose the heavy fabric of the veil over the seemingly comfortable yet legally erasing trap of the marriage altar. They redefined what it meant to be a capable, independent woman long before the law ever gave them permission to do so. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this incredible history leaves you wanting to explore more of the hidden stories that built our world.